It is my honor to welcome you to a public lecture by this year's Ellsberg activist in residence, Varshini Prakash. She's been on campus since Monday, visiting classes, meeting informally with students and faculty, holding office hours, and she'll be here through the week. This lecture is being hosted on the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtic Nation on the land of the Newoteg community. We also acknowledge that UMass Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Moral Land Grant Act, portions of land from 82 Native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. I want to begin with a few words about Daniel Ellsberg, who was the inspiration for our work. In 2019, the Robert Cox Special Collections and University Archives at UMass acquired Ellsberg's papers, a treasure trove of more than 600 boxes of material. Many of you know that in 1971, Ellsberg released to the press and public a 7,000-page secret history of the Vietnam War, the so-called Pentagon Papers, exposing decades of government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of that war. What is less well known is that Ellsberg devoted the next 50-plus years of his life until his death last year, or in 2023, I should say, to nonviolent activism in pursuit of nuclear disarmament, First Amendment rights, a more democratic and less imperial foreign policy. And in his papers, you can also trace a growing interest in and commitment to environmental justice. If he were still alive, I'm sure Dan would be thrilled about this year's activist in residence. If you want to learn more about our work and our effort to build a permanently endowed institute and perhaps even make a donation, please visit our website. It's eipad.org. A brief word about some exciting upcoming programs. On March 13th, we will have a webinar on the twin threats of nuclear weapons and climate change, how one peril might trigger the other, and what steps we can take to unite the movements to end both threats. On that panel will be Ira Helfand, who's here tonight, and I want to acknowledge because he was our first Ellsberg activist in residence, a founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility and many other organizations, and one of the nation's most important anti-nuclear activists. In April, we'll have a series of 3 webinars on the Vietnam War to mark the 50th anniversary of the war's end. And as a capstone event on April 30th, we have invited to campus for a talk and reading the acclaimed Vietnamese novelist and poet Nguyen Phan Quay Mai. Has written many books, including The Mountains Sing, which I highly recommend to you. A few thank yous. First to Brendan Tierney in the back, who's a project assistant for the initiative, who's done so much all year of the detailed planning and organizing, and our student intern, Melissa D'Addario. This week is been supported in part by a grant from a UMass program called Advancing Community Democracy and Dialogue. A number of colleagues and departments across campus have helped to organize this week. I especially want to thank Malcolm Sen in English, Thad Miller in the School of Public Policy, Regine Spector in Political Science, Jen Sandler, Director of the UMass Alliance for Community Transformation, Lena Fletcher, Director of the Natural Resources Conservation Program, and Roizen and Darcy Maresca in the School of Earth and Sustainability. Also, we have with us, as you can see by their fabulous T-shirts, a number of members of Sunrise Movement, and I'm going to ask one of them to come up and make a short statement. Angel, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Cool. My name is Angel Silverio. I'm an organizer with the Sunrise Hub here at UMass. Just a little bit about us, if you're curious. We are part of building the student movement that's emerging on campus right now, and specifically we're pushing for a Green New Deal that includes students across race and class and demanding a just and livable future for all. And our focus this year is to make sure that UMass makes meaningful climate action, ensuring that they recommit to their carbon zero by 2032, and building a better university for workers, students, and the communities around us, prioritizing its folks other than the fossil fuel and monetary interests. So if you're a student and you're interested in getting involved, definitely reach out to one of us. We have a table over there with a sign-up sheet, and you can hit us up on Instagram at Sunrise UMass. Definitely love to talk to you more about it. Thank you.
After the lecture, we will have time for questions. Kevin Young will serve as our moderator. Professor Young is a colleague of mine in the history department. He's a specialist in modern Latin American history and a dedicated political and union activist. Kevin's most recent book, published last year, could not be more relevant to tonight's event, and I highly recommend it. It's called Abolishing Fossil Fuels: Lessons from Movements That Won. After Varshini's talk, Kevin will ask her a question or two and then open it up to you. So if you do have a question, we're going to ask that you line up on that side of the room, and Brennan will provide you with a microphone. Now, a few words about Varshini Prakash. She graduated from UMass, as many of you know, in 2015, where she became deeply involved in the campaign to push the administration to divest from fossil fuels and to commit the university to the goal of carbon neutrality. 2 years later, Varshini went on to co-found the Sunrise Movement, a youth-led climate justice organization. She was the executive director of Sunrise for 5 years. In 2019, she received the Sierra Club's John Muir Award, and that same year, Time magazine put her on their 100 most influential people list. In that issue, the then governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, wrote, "Varshini and other young leaders have permanently fixed climate change into the nation's conscience as a moral imperative, an issue of economic justice, and a way to create millions of jobs across America." Varshini is also the co-author of a book called The Green New Deal: Why We Must, How We Can. That was published in 2020. So please join me in welcoming Varshini Prakash.
Okay. Good evening. How's it going? Pretty good. I'm really glad to be with you. I'm very grateful to be here back on this campus. This is my 10-year reunion, or since I graduated from UMass. I graduated in the year of 2015, and it was my 12-year reunion this semester of joining the Fossil Fuel Divestment campaign and finding my kind of just like purpose in activism and in movements. So it feels momentous and meaningful to be here with all of you at that time in sort of my life cycle as an organizer. And I just I'm really grateful for the fact that this initiative exists. Usually us activists are not invited back with this level of sort of like pomp and glory, so I'm very grateful for it. I just want to say thank you to Chris and to Brennan and to everyone who made this possible. And it's a really beautiful concept in Activists in Residence, and I've been enjoying my time talking to students and getting to hear y'all's stories and seeing so many Sunrise folks. I spent Monday evening with about 30 members of the Sunrise chapter here at UMass, and I'm very excited about what they're going to be cooking up over the next few weeks and months and years. So, my name is Varshini Prakash. I am the daughter of 2 Indian immigrants who came to this country looking for economic opportunity in the 1980s. And my parents grew up in India. My dad in a place called Chennai, and my mom in a place called Bangalore in southern India. And they settled on just the eastern side of this state, right outside of Boston. And I live now in East Boston, a beautiful neighborhood right on the Boston Harbor, the original land of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts people who have lived in that area for 12,000 years, and more recent flows of migration that followed settlement by Westerners included the Irish fleeing famine and poverty in the late 1800s, and Italians arriving throughout the 20th century. And since the late 1900s, families like myself and Central and South Americans and folks from the Middle East. And it is a beautiful place that is filled with lots of different people. And I just wonder how many more years of migrants will shape and give color to this place that's filled, side by side with old school pizza shops and pupuserias right next to one another, when this is also Boston's most flood vulnerable neighborhood. And the home I live in right now is threatened by at least a foot of sea level rise, if not 3 to 4 by mid to late this century. But going back a little bit, I spent my childhood in a beautiful town that's not unlike the Pioneer Valley, right outside of Boston, as I said. And while the places we live are always full of a lot of contradictions, the best part of my childhood was the hours that I spent. Sometimes it felt like every waking moment that I could outside as a kid. And I'm grateful for this time. It was the time of flinging mud pies, stealing flowers from my neighbors, creating secret gardens. Sometimes I just walk into the narrow stretch of trees behind my house and pause and just listen to the birds and the stillness and the rustling of squirrels and the trees. And it was refuge. It was peace. It was creativity. It was imagination. It was freedom. And it was a place that I felt at home when oftentimes in life I didn't feel so at home in myself, growing up as a brown girl with curly hair in America. And this was my first love. And I refuse very much in this exact moment to lose my grasp on that first love and that first gratitude, that sense of belonging and abundance that I think every single one of us has found at some point, at the top of a mountain, in a wave of the ocean, in a song, in a really good conversation with a friend over a fire pit, whatever it might be. Just a moment when the value and sacredness of the world was revealed to you, just as it was. Maybe you're imagining something like that for yourself right now that pertains to your life. And my parents had taught me from a young age to be grateful for what I had. Both were raised on tight budgets and close quarters in a country that was just growing into a fledgling nation out from under the grip of British colonization. To not take anything for granted, that the food on our table, that the home that we lived in, that nothing was guaranteed, and it was all a blessing. But as I got older, I started to realize that this home that I loved so much was being destroyed. And I started learning about the floods that were fueled by climate change, that were drowning communities where my family was from in India, in Kerala and Chennai and all over, really, looking eerily similar to images that I'd seen from Hurricane Katrina or Sandy in New Orleans. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and Sandy, or any number of storms and floods and hurricanes since then, or how the severe pollution from the tailpipes of cars and trucks contributed to my family's asthma, or the stories I heard from communities in coal cities and states where water was running black and orange from coal factories and mountaintop removal, or lighting on fire from methane leaks. And all the while, as a teenager, the tick of pollution in the atmosphere from fossil fuels was escalating with every year I got older, in large part due to the corporate greed of politicians who denied the reality of the science in order to keep polluting. So I was so angry about all of this, and I was so angry about the way in which my home and our collective home was being destroyed. And I didn't really know what to do about it, but I was pissed off. And so my early acts of resistance included following my mother around the house, turning off every light after she had turned it on. It was, scowling heavily at my friends that were throwing that bottle into the trash instead of the recycling. Has anyone been that person in their life? Okay, yeah, we have a few. So those were my early acts of resistance. But when I got to campus at UMass, I was determined to do something different. I was like, okay, this is not working. And I took a class called Grassroots Community Organizing 12 years ago. Anyone here from GCO? Okay, we've got one or two UACT people. Okay, we've got a couple. And halfway through that class, I ended up getting on a bus and going with 60 other people from UMass to DC for a mass rally against the Keystone XL pipeline. And I got off that bus, and I found myself in the midst of 40,000 people in DC for a march against that pipeline, including indigenous leaders, farmers, climate activists, people like Bill McKibben, who I know was on campus just a few months ago. And for the first time in my life, I felt this sense of power, of connection, of not feeling isolated in my fear and in my despair about the future. Really, I discovered the power and the transformation that is possible within social movements, within organizing. And I came back to campus with a mission, the sense that the best way to be in solidarity with the indigenous communities I had heard from, the environmental justice communities I had heard from, was to organize right where I was on this campus for a better future. And that ended up being the Fossil Fuel Divestment campaign. And I learned that organizing was different from advocacy or charity that tend to work within the status quo or even reify the status quo. But organizing was about enabling a community to come together, to learn together, to act together, and to even win together against what seems like impossible circumstances, by building collective power that fundamentally challenges and changes the status quo of our conditions and our lives. And I learned that democracy is not just something done at the ballot box every 4 years as some rote civic duty, but that our obligation to building a life and really a shared politic together goes so much further to our commitment to really figuring out the problems of our society and showing up in relationship every day to realize the vision of a world we want to see. And that this work would be structured, not just as a club or a hangout, but as a purposive campaign that was driving and increasing in power, relationships, and strategically using our collective resources together towards a goal. And that if we did all that, we could go toe-to-toe, head-to-head with some of the most powerful industries in the history of the world, and maybe even win. That is what I learned. And as like a 5 foot tall brown girl in America, I was like sold. I was like, I've never felt powerful in my life, but this is something. And so I joined the movement for fossil fuel divestment on campus. And for those of you who are, how many people have heard of fossil fuel divestment here? I feel like a fair few. Okay, cool. I don't need to go through it. This campaign became my life. And over the course of the 3 years, or 2.5 years that I was on campus, and then 1 year of coaching a team, we did a tremendous amount of things. We started out with a set of demands and a letter to the administration. We spent weeks and weeks collecting 4,000 plus petition signatures, roughly 20% of the student body, through hard-won conversations, class visits, dorm storms, dozens and dozens and dozens of direct conversations with people. We held marches and rallies. We showed up at Board of Trustees meetings, whether they wanted us there or not. We held negotiations with school administrators, and some who were sympathetic, others who were very much not. It involved a process of acting collectively. You'll see on the left side, there was a banner drop over the parking garage. There were marches and rallies. The one on the bottom is me I guess I'm like 20 years, I don't know. That was my sophomore year, I think. A cycle of acting and bringing people in through action, training the people who showed up at that action and giving them the concrete skills to organize and politically educate them about the issues that were going on. Recruiting and then training and then bringing those individuals who we trained back into an action cycle. So it was this, what we call a cycle of momentum that was building over the course of several semesters. And if you need any more incentives to join movements, the person on the bottom right there, I am now married to. So that's my husband. And so if you don't want to come for the cause, you can at least come for the boo. And, you might end up for both. So, and we've been together for 10 years as of this year. Cool. And I want to give people just like a sense of what this effort actually looked like. It started in 2012. I won't go through every single piece of this, and it's not exactly chronological, but it wasn't just a single protest, or it wasn't just a single, SGA vote or something of that nature. This was a sustained campaign over several semesters, several years, that required significant leadership development, training of new people, collective action, not just on this campus, but with actually dozens and hundreds of schools all across the nation as well. So it wasn't just happening at UMass, but at one point there were over, 200 or 300 of these campaigns that had popped off all across college campuses in the 2012 to 2015 period. And in the summer of 2016, I think it was March or April of 2016, I was actually graduated at this time, but the team that I had coached and developed held a week-long sit-in where over 1,000 people participated each day. I remember they started out with 22 people on Monday morning. By the next day, it had grown to 45. The next day, it was at 150. The day after that, I remember walking through the halls of Whitmore. What the picture on the bottom left is part of that, where there were almost 350 people lining all the way from the chancellor's office out the door. This was like an escalation that took place over a week, and in the course of this, we held hours and hours of negotiations with the president and with the chancellor. We were doing daily press meetings and making sure that we were getting the story out to the collegiate and local press. There were ongoing trainings, and this was just like a collective endeavor. I remember waking up at 5 a.m. to get out there and then spending from 9 p.m. to midnight planning out everything that we were going to do the next day. So it was a really intense but powerful atmosphere. And about a month later, we received notice that the university was making a commitment to divest UMass from fossil fuels, and that we were to become the first major public university to make such a commitment. So it was a huge, huge win. And I know we've made some progress towards that, and there's still some work to be done. But I think it just really showed the power of what these sustained campaigns and efforts led by young people, but aided and supported by the broader campus community, can achieve. I'm going to take a second and drink some water. And so I graduated in the summer of 2015. And this was the tail end of the Obama years. Where were you at this time in 2015? I feel like we have a range of perspectives. What were you doing in 2015? Anyone want to share? Bernie, okay. Anyone else? High school, okay, great. Anyone in middle school? People were in middle school, right? I'm like, yeah, all y'all were in middle school. Okay, so there was this guy named Obama, and he was president. And this was the tail end of the Obama years. This is roughly 2015. And there was a lot that was won. There was this burgeoning grassroots movement. There was this, the first international global agreement on climate had been signed, the Paris Accords. We had some of the first executive actions on climate, some of the first steps towards federal climate policy. But as climate report after climate report came and the alarms were just sounding with increased urgency, I think a lot of us who were young people at this time couldn't hold back this sinking feeling in our hearts that our existing movements weren't enough, that we didn't have the scale, that we didn't have the power to truly contest in American politics to stop the greatest existential threat of our lifetimes and for our generation. And divestment was an incredibly powerful tactic, but it had been largely focused on a lot of private institutions moving money, at least at the collegiate and campus level. But we needed action that included and went beyond that. And we needed it at a greater scale. And that there were millions of young people just like us who didn't have a political vehicle to vocalize their fear and frustration and fight for a better world. So we knew in this moment that we actually needed the full-throated support of the federal government, and that we needed the federal government to put the power of its purse towards a mobilization of our economy to stop climate change. And so a few friends and I gathered young leaders from across the climate movement, the youth climate movement, from fossil fuel divestment fights and UN international fights and the Keystone XL era and all of that. And we spent a year in study and development of a strategy that had a simple vision. It was to make climate action that was rooted in economic and racial justice and national priority in every corner of this country. And Sunrise formed to take the anger and the grief and the hope we have into bringing this crisis we face to the doorsteps of the most powerful people in the world and pressuring them to deliver the change that we deserve. So it was really at the nexus of electoral politics and movement politics and protest. We had some pretty humble beginnings. We started in the summer of 2017, training in the basement of churches and sleeping on couches, but the movement grew over time. And so we did trainings in dozens of different cities, and we had actions that were attempting to call out the way in which our politicians were taking money from fossil fuel PACs and CEOs, and the way in which our political system was really becoming captured and controlled by the fossil fuel industry, and the impact that was happening on our ability to pass federal climate legislation. And one of the major moments that happened, I think, let's see, it's on the bottom left there. In the summer of 2018, we saw, after Donald Trump was elected, we saw a sweep of a number of progressive candidates who got elected to office. These were people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, who's my congresswoman, and this sweep of new, younger, women of color, working class leaders that were coming into federal government. And as part of this resistance to Trump and some of the backlash, or some of the reaction to the Trump administration, that Democrats might actually have a chance of winning back the House in the fall of 2018. And so we wanted to be prepared. and to say if Democrats were gonna take back leadership within the House, that they needed to have a plan of what to do about the greatest existential threat of our generation. And so we did this demonstration at Nancy Pelosi's office, who was then the Speaker of the House, newly elected, or of that version of the, what am I trying to say? That version of the House. Thank you. And we brought with us 200 young people from across the country and staged a sit-in. And we sang songs and we told stories. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on her first day in Congress, came and joined us. And we really were asking, what is your plan? What is your plan? And our demands were just that any person that wanted to hold the mantle of high leadership needed to swear off taking money from the oil and gas industry and needed to have a plan for how to address the climate crisis in a way that improved racial disparities and secured economic justice for all. And after this action, things popped off. All of a sudden, tens of thousands, like the Green New Deal, emerged into the public consciousness. This was a vision of a plan, really it was a policy framework that was attempting to secure a vision of climate action that was rooted in the creation of millions of good, high-paying jobs and in building racial equity to ensure that we didn't just deepen the existing societal inequalities that exist today. This was really attempting to make climate action a working class vision and not just a transition into a renewable energy economy for elites, as well as to build upon the demands and work that the environmental justice movement had been doing for 30, 40, 50 years, far before I even came on the scene, but trying to take those demands and make them mainstream and force the federal government to actually put its backing and energy behind ensuring that that was how we dealt with climate change. And so over the next year, we saw tens of thousands of young people emerge through the word work and get involved in our movement. We worked to get every single Democrat who was running for president on board and releasing some of the most ambitious climate plans that we have ever seen in history. And the reason why is because young people showed up to every single town hall that they were in and asked them whether they supported a Green New Deal and what their plan was to stop the climate crisis. We campaigned for and elected climate champions. We held hundreds of local town halls in cities and states across the country and invited electeds and partners and labor unions and environmental justice groups. We went on tour. We got hundreds of elected officials to commit to not taking money from the fossil fuel industry. And this was all happening also within the backdrop of a global movement that was erupting around climate action all over the world. I don't know if people remember the Fridays for Future movement that was taking place at the same time with Greta Thunberg, but 7 million students took action as part of the Fridays for Future school strikes on one event. None of this really happened by accident. This was about an active effort of recruiting and training and supporting people to do online to offline action. During this time, you could also see the way in which public support on the issue of climate change was dramatically increasing, and support for renewable energy and climate action was increasing. Some of that has changed in recent years, in large part because of the level of backlash that we received by the fossil fuel industry and the Republican Party and the Fox News machine. But you could see a marked difference just in a matter of a year or two as the movement was emerging in its intensity, of the level of public opinion shifts that were happening around climate and clean energy as well. And so during this time, after Joe Biden was elected in the fall of 2020, a lot of the work that the movement had done had actually translated into Joe Biden's public agenda. After Bernie Sanders lost in early 2020, I was asked to participate as part of this task force, a Bernie Biden unity task force. And we were able to actually use the power of the movement to shape the agenda of the future president of the United States of America. And I know that wasn't just because, I'm great, but I know that it wasn't just because of me. I know that was because of the power of millions of young people who were freaking out about the climate crisis and making their fear and their urgency and their hope known to hundreds of elected officials across the country and to the Democratic Party largely. And so as part of this task force, we were able to push them to increase their ambition, to put forward the $1.5 trillion Build Back Better plan that included significant advancements on climate and clean energy and justice and jobs. We were able to secure, which is now dead, but a American Climate Corps, which would have attempted to employ thousands of young people in the work of job preparedness and training for jobs in environmental and renewable energy jobs for the future. So this was an incredible way that we were actually seeing movements not just exist on the external to power and policy, but actually making our way into the halls of power and this synergy between both the inside game and the outside game that I think is actually really vital and necessary for us to make lasting change over time. And so we did see, a significant reduction of the original vision, but the Green New Deal, like its name supposes, and its inspiration was the New Deal. The Green New Deal was never supposed to be a single bill or a single moment or anything like that. It was actually supposed to be a governing agenda for 10 years or longer. And the original vision for it was a $10 trillion investment over 10 years. And eventually when when Joe Biden was elected, we saw the Build Back Better version of it, which ended up being a $1.5 trillion package, still really, really sizable, and then eventually became, through, unfortunately, a lot of negotiations with Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, who I believe receives more money from his coal investments than he does as a member of Congress, reduced down to a roughly 400, this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, which ended up being a $400 billion, although I think that is the absolute floor of what it could be if it was enacted fully. A $400 billion massive investment in renewable energy, in a lot of significant environmental justice programs and labor provisions that would never have been won if the movement did not call for and fight for it. So that was huge. This was a massive, I would say in 2018, climate was essentially like a political non-starter. It was a third rail issue. No one really wanted to deal with it. And to go from that level of political irrelevancy to being one of the core issues for young people who showed out in significant numbers in the 2020 election, and then to have it be a central pillar and litmus test for the Democratic Party in the 2020 election, and then to be a core pillar of one of the most important legislative achievements by the last president is significant. And that work will continue to act upon the world, even with this current administration. And so, a little bit of just like what we've won. I mentioned a few things. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, something that I've heard from people who are in the White House itself, I think people are probably wondering whether or not all of this is just going to be destroyed in this exact moment. But something that I've heard directly from people who worked on this is that somewhere between 90% or more of the grants that were committed from the federal government have been legally committed, which means that they cannot legally be pulled back. And these are provisions that require money to be allocated to communities on the front lines of climate change. And these are, somewhere around, I'm not sure exactly because everything is a little bit difficult to tell right now, but at least tens of billions of dollars are going to go to projects that are required to work with community organizations, labor unions, communities that have environmental justice organizations, and in a concrete way actually develop the power of these communities in local place. And these are communities that have never received this kind of direct investment in American history, in the context of the climate crisis. And while I believe there is a significant level of investment that actually needs to continue to be made, billions of dollars going directly to these communities will change the landscape of many of these places for a long time. And I think it cannot be understated how important the role that the movement played in centering those priorities around racial justice and economic justice in securing the kinds of victories that we were able to secure. I think it was a slightly, I don't want to go into like all of the details of the IRA, and we can talk about that at a later point, but one thing about it is it was a bit of an imperfect victory. I think it was a sort of like all carrots, no sticks. So we have this almost like parallel creation of this dual economy, one that is still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and as we're seeing with this, current administration is attempting to ramp up fossil fuels at the exact time when we should be ramping down, but also a economy where renewable energy is cheap and abundant, and it is rapidly growing. And I think what the last 10 years of organizing have achieved is that I believe this train has left the station. Like, we are not ever going to go fully back to where we were at the beginning of when, Sunrise started. And it's not just Sunrise, but I do not believe that we are going to go all the way back, and that there are mechanisms and systems far beyond us, including the global economy, that are going to mean that the transition towards renewable energy is inevitable. And just a few other things from the last 10 years. Around divestment, we have divested assets totaling in the trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry. The Keystone XL pipeline was never built, in large part due to the resistance of everyday people. Trump, I just read that he wants to revive it, but the company that originally proposed the pipeline does not even want to deal. We saw the resistance, one of the largest indigenous resistances in recent memory, through the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline for indigenous sovereignty, which has really seared this rallying cry around water is life into the ethos of a lot of the movement. And we also inspired and propelled movements all across the world. Every day I talk to people in Italy and France and UK and Australia, and the work that happened as a part of Sunrise that many people were a part of, and the work around the Green New Deal in the United States has inspired significant action in the Green Deal in the European Union. I've seen parts of this in Australia, in Canada, and also that was like a feedback loop. I think our the global youth movement for climate, I don't think that we could have succeeded as far as we did in the United States without that global youth movement. Okay, how we doing? with me? Okay. Ooh. All right. So a few things I just want to say. Young people matter. Young people matter. And their participation is incredibly vital to the success of any social movement. And I have seen this time and time and time and time again. I think, some of our inspirations for Sunrise and the stories that we read and heard about were from the Civil Rights Movement and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Mississippi, the Freedom Rides, and the Nashville Lunch Counter sit-ins. Those were young people. The immigrant rights and immigrant justice movement, a lot of the organizing that we saw around Gaza most recently, ACT UP and the fight against HIV and AIDS, and the like just powerful resistance of young queer people who were under threat and just dying by the thousands, and the level of like fearlessness and anger and power that was generated from that movement. The movement for Black Lives, which I feel, followed actually like a very similar pattern around the 2010s of some of the Ferguson uprisings, and then the most recent movements around George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, where 25 million people were in the streets during that that cycle of movement. And I think that might be the largest act of civil resistance that we've ever seen in the United States. And young people, actually one thing I just want to say about the young people matter part. The role that young people play is really like the superpower of young people is that, can I say we anymore? I don't know. I'm like, what do you guys think? Do I count? I don't know. I had to like hide my wedding ring sometimes when I was going and talking to people because I was like, I don't know if I'm allowed to be married. But anyway, the role that we play that I think is so meaningful is that we are completely unattached to paradigms and the status quo needing to be what it is. And that the mobilization, that young people are so powerful at being able to articulate a problem and articulate a vision and suspend the like decades of status quo thinking that the rest of the country or the rest of the population may be under the spell of. And they can lift all boats and create this ripple effect that even if they don't have all the institutional power, or they don't have, they're not like located in positions of power, that it can create this ripple effect where so much change is able to happen and people are kind of like woken up to a new reality and a new way that they should be operating. So I'll say that. And I also really feel that we could never have done this alone. And this is like the most limited, there's like 500 other organizations and entities that I would put on this diagram. But successful movements require a movement ecosystem. We require an inside game that has a Jay Inslee running for president and putting forward the most comprehensive climate legislation that raises the bar for every other presidential candidate that is running. We require an AOC and a squad that is unapologetic about the vision that they are calling for and vociferously fighting for the full scope of what the solutions might be, and Ed Markey. And you know what? We also require a Joe Biden. And the reason why is because we require many of the massive pieces of legislation and big moments that have been passed in American history required some form of moderated or a person in power that was willing to be moved by the pressures of the movement. And if when we are fighting for electoral power, that is not the end game. When we are fighting in an election, we are really just fighting for terrain, for the fight to continue. And so we did win that with Joe Biden on this particular issue, and there are other issues that I disagree with him about and his take on that. But that was a part of the inside game as well. I think there was I would not describe it as part of the movement, but I think that was an essential piece. We had political organizations like the Working Families Party and Justice Democrats that were recruiting candidates and running them for office who were climate champions. And there's many, many other organizations like Climate Hawks Vote and, League of Conservation Vote, anyway, there's many, many others. We needed the global movement for the climate strikes. We needed the Extinction Rebellion energy that was being created in Europe. We needed community organizations and environmental justice organizations and indigenous organizations like IEN and CJA and People's Action and Indivisible. And we needed unions. We needed unions like all three that are listed here supported the Green New Deal in some kind of official capacity. But many of these unions, like the AFL-CIO and other entities that were less inclined to be sort of out front on something like the Green New Deal, were also a key part of the negotiations. And I think a key part of when Joe Biden passed this policy, he said, when I think climate, I think jobs, which I think that was a tremendous shift from the way that we had previously experienced the way that our politicians talk about climate change. The next piece I'll say is we need to organize around vision, and we need to lead with hope and spirit. And when I say that, I think for the first few years of my climate organizing, we were really, really focused on what we were stopping, the bad, the fighting pipeline by pipeline, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I also have really felt compelled and moved by what it means to organize around vision and how much people just want a vision of what the world could look like. And they want to organize, and it makes it a lot easier for people to also organize around shared values. Like, we all want clean air. We all want clean water. We want soil that is not poisoning us as we grow our food. We want to get around on clean, affordable transit. We want to live in homes that are not crumbling or lead-riddled or, that are powered with cheap renewable energy. And I think it felt the Green New Deal, at least for a time, until we really got attacked pretty heavily, felt like it could be this kind of awe-inspiring vision. And we saw so many people coming up with their own pieces around this, like building out different sections of it. An indigenous Green New Deal, a farmer's Green New Deal, or a Green New Deal for rural communities, the Gulf South Green New Deal. Really, it created the imaginative space. And I also would ask you all to consider where in our work and in our work can we really be leading with vision. And the other piece is around leading with spirit and heart. It's hard to share on a slide, but if you look up any action that Sunrise did, there was always singing. There was always singing, and there was always art, and there was always storytelling. And I think so many of the powerful movements that have come before us, whether it was civil rights or many union movements, have led with song. And song just affords us a way to communicate our solidarity in a world that is like constantly trying to atomize us and separate us and make us feel like individuals. Song and art and these ways of relating with one another that are not so cerebral and intellectual and actually just are about expressing solidarity, both in action but also just as like ways to connect, are really important. And on an issue, it's not even an issue, on a challenge that is as scaled and existential as the climate crisis is, we need joy, we need spirit, we need these things to be embedded within the fabric of our organizing traditions and our work, or we are not actually going to be able to survive and stay with what I believe is a lifelong, what we need is actually a lifelong commitment from each of us to continue to do this work. And the last thing I'll say on this piece is that change takes time, and it takes multiple cycles of movements. And I can only speak from what I'm just like conscious of. I have been, in the climate movement for about 12 years now. And even within that, I think I saw about 3 different major cycles of mobilization, of uprising, of contraction, of evolution, and of renovation of the movement itself. And that this was, each one came with its feeling of like this zero gravity moment of like extreme hope and possibility, and then this like heart-wrenching demobilization and feeling of disillusionment and loss, and then the process of learning and digesting and reflecting on what that was like, to come away with some new understandings of how we try again. And the first piece of federal climate legislation that people attempted was Waxman-Markey in 2010, which failed. And taking the lessons from that failure and trying to incorporate them into the strategy and vision of Sunrise meant that, we were able to learn from subsequent successes and losses. And 2010, 2022 was when we finally actually secured federal climate legislation. And that's just what I remember. And I'm sure that the actual fights to do that sooner, or, just like build greater capacity for legislative possibilities around climate were ongoing for significantly before that, but that's just even what I remember. Yeah, okay. And so just a couple things. Let's see, where are we at? Oh, I gotta close. Okay. The current ecological conditions, we currently exist at levels of pollution right now, which are at concentrations I believe we saw last on planet Earth around 2 million years ago. And I do not even believe the species Homo sapiens existed yet, if I read that right. And it feels like a rote statement at this point, because it feels like every year is like this, but 2024 was the hottest year on record. And I think we're seeing manifestations of this crisis live and in the public eye just far more regularly than when I was on this campus 10 years ago. I was down in Asheville, North Carolina after Hurricane Helene, and you just would walk up to people in small businesses who were trying to keep their lives afloat during heavy tourist season, which had gotten completely destroyed because of the hurricane, and just ask them how they were doing, and their eyes were just full of tears. Or the LA fires, and the images that I was seeing of just bicycles and debris all over that have just aerosolized in the midst. That is not, I don't think that's a word, but that were destroyed and just don't even exist and are just ash all over the city, and the just like devastation of what is happening in such an immediate and visceral way that I don't think that did not exist when in the exact same way when I was here on campus. And so I really think at this point that for the last 10 years of my life, I was like, we are gonna stop the climate crisis. I was like, we have to stop the climate crisis. And I said that recently to one of my mentors and friends who's in the immigrant rights movement. He was like, y'all climate people are kind of crazy. You really thought you could change the weather. That is a wild thing to think that you could do. And in some ways it was, but I really, really believed that it had to happen and put every fiber of my soul into trying to make it happen. And I'm glad we did, because we made some significant strides forward. But at this exact point in my life, I don't believe that stopping climate change is possible. I believe that slowing climate change and reducing the worst of climate change is possible. But the climate is changing, and some level of warming is going to be locked in no matter what. And so that means that our fight today is as much about stopping the burning of pollution and fossil fuels that got us into this mess to begin with, as it is about ensuring and beginning to ensure the resilience of our communities to these disasters, to predicting and inoculating against the crises that will come, and supporting people to interpret and understand what is happening all around us as the climate crisis. And I think, just a few words on this current political moment. I think we are in a period that is very dangerous, where we are experiencing kind of the erosion of democratic values and institutions. And there's this sort of emerging kleptocracy with people who are enriching themselves at the expense of our public services and support systems for working people. I think I read that the valuation of Elon Musk's companies has gone up to like $600 billion or something like that at this point. And there is this just unholy alliance taking place between corporate oligarchs and the Christian nationalist right, and it's like disturbingly explicit emergence of a political worldview that is trying to return us back to visions of social hierarchy, racial and gender hierarchy, through, like a techno-feudalism. And so just one thing that I'll leave you with is that, according to a study of about kind of like the predicted probability of stopping backsliding of democracies taken in the last 30 years with no movement, was about 7%. And with the movement, 55%. So it's not amazing news, but we are already starting to see the sort of, the resistance and some of the movement rising and speaking out, and where we are fighting back, we are having impact and slowly impacting these the severe corruption and repression that is happening. I saw that Tesla sales took a hit in Europe by 45%, while rival EV company sales increased by 37%. Thousands of people have been showing up at Tesla stores around the country and in town halls to protest Elon Musk attempting to buy his way into running our country. There have been thousands and thousands and thousands of people calling their congresspeople of all political parties. We've had numerous legal victories already and attempting to slow the pace of the sort of like gutting of our federal workforce. some of these actions have just been like really remarkable. And I suggest everyone go to choosedemocracy.org, and they have a running ticker of a lot of these actions that have been taking place. And we have to have a movement that is broad, that is popular. People do not support what is happening in our country, and more people are waking up to this reality every day. And I believe, as we're talking, just like an hour ago, I saw that Trump announced that they are trying to cut 65% of the workforce of the EPA. And as someone who grew up about a couple miles from a closed Superfund site, I really, really want the EPA and the federal workforce that is tracking hazardous waste sites and responding to citizen concerns to continue. And so I would say in this moment, solidarity is the antidote to fascism. I think if people can join visible moments of action and really show social proof that we are not okay with the direction this country is headed, showing up and building with real people in physical place and answering calls to action as we can, and mobilizing around hope, not just around fear, is really important as well. And the last thing, just on climate, and then I'm done, I think moving forward, our task, and we can talk more about this specifically, is preparing for disaster and building for resilience. There are already a number of climate resilience hubs that are popping up all over the country, which are community institutions that are helping to educate residents about extreme weather preparedness. There are a number. I saw one that's maybe in Northampton, but I didn't see any around here on the map. We need to be building the new and continuing to push and advance for an equitable and renewable energy economy wherever we can, locally and at the state level and beyond the offensive, even under the auspices of this administration. And we need to stop the bad wherever we can. I know there are, I was talking to a friend who runs the Asia Pacific Environmental Network, who just settled with Chevron for $500 million for a lot of their polluting activities in Richmond, California, or making polluters pay bills, which are really trying to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for the damages that have been wrought as a result of climate disasters. Okay, and so I think we need to protect what we can at the federal level and organize to win back power in 26 and 28, and we need to organize at all levels, local to advance, state to advance and protect, federal to defend and limit the damage. But I think we have come immeasurable and powerful ways in the last 10 years, and we will never actually truly know the full extent of what that will look like for years to come. But I am just like grateful to have been a part of that journey. And with many of you, I see a lot of you as old friends and experts and academics and student leaders and just like have seen familiar faces throughout that journey. And so, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Hi. All right. Well, I think that was exactly what I needed at this point. We are in very frightening times, terrifying times. And what I most appreciated about everything you just said, Varshini, is the message of collective power. I think that now more than ever, as so many of us, I imagine many of us in this room, are struggling with a feeling of helplessness and despair. And that's part of the point, right? They want us to fall into despair. But that whole narrative that you gave us, from your first trip to DC, and just the sense of empowerment was really vivid in what you said. I really appreciated that. And thinking about our current moment, where we see not only the escalation of ecological destruction at every level, but we also see so much institutional and corporate and governmental backsliding on even the inadequate pledges that had already been made years ago. We see it at the level of UMass Amherst right here, where the campus is backtracking from its carbon zero by 2032 plan. We see it in the way that UMass continues to invest in all kinds of indirect ways in the fossil fuel industry, despite the historic victory of 2016 against the direct holdings in fossil fuels. And so one phrase that you said early on was, you talked about organizing in what seemed like impossible circumstances. And so I wanted to ask you a question based on that statement. And specifically, if you could talk a little bit about who your historical reference points and heroes are, who you look to for inspiration. Since I teach in the history department, they told me I had to ask a history question. So if you could talk a little bit more about that. You mentioned some of the historical movements that you look to, but if you could elaborate on that a little bit, where do you draw your strength from in terms of historical figures and movements?
Yeah. I would say I have found the civil rights movement to be one of the most inspiring, just like awe-inspiring movements that I have studied and learned from. And when it comes to courage, like nothing I have done can even hold like a candle to what these young people and just black folks in the civil rights movement, and some white folks too, have did and sacrificed and risked in order to end segregation and Jim Crow. And I'm talking about that, the particular context around the 50s and 60s, but it's been a very, very, very long struggle. I remember and would encourage everyone to check out some of the books from this time period that explain this in greater detail, but I remember just hearing the stories of how Reverend James Lawson would work with these students in Nashville, and for months and months they would learn and study deeply what nonviolence was. He had learned about nonviolence in India for 3 years when he had been studying the nonviolent resistance movement against the British Empire, and come back to teach that to the civil rights movement in America. And they would literally practice what it would mean to be yelled at racist slurs, intimidation, to be called names, and to be frightened when they would eventually go to try to desegregate lunch counters in the city, and to practice that and to know that and to be so kind of like committed to your own dignity, your own freedom, your own liberation, and then the risk it then took to do that, to stay, to then be sent to jail, and just like some of these leaders like Diane Nash and John Lewis and so many others are so inspiring to me. And there's like similar stories like that. I think Parting the Waters is probably the book I would most recommend, and like the vivid stories of the Montgomery bus boycott and how much leadership they really had. I mean, these folks were, for a year, moving 30,000 people in like basically carpools in order to desegregate buses in the South. And so, yeah, I think that's my primary inspiration. And I just, whenever things get tough, I'm like, yeah, we don't even know.
Well, thinking about in the future, we go, the peak of the civil rights movement was about 60 years ago. If we go forward 60 years in the future, right, many of us will, maybe not me, but many of you will still be alive, you younger people. And, who will the historical heroes from this era be? There's no doubt in my mind that those of you wearing Sunrise Movement t-shirts, everyone involved in the climate movement today is going to be remembered similarly, right? Well, we have a little bit of time left for folks who want to ask questions of Varshini. If you want to line up on that side, Brennan's over there with a mic. So if you want to form a line, I'm sure that people have questions you want to ask. Now's your chance. If not, I can just keep asking questions. Don't tempt me.
Hi, so I just had a question about what you studied at UMass and kind of how that inspired your journey and where you are today.
Great. Love to be asked what my major was. I missed that. I studied environmental science and political science. I did a dual. I did have a great moment one time when I sat down at an event and someone asked me what my major was. And I was like, environmental science and political science. And then he went, oh, neither of which are sciences. That was pretty brutal. But I feel great about it. Yeah. And I don't know. I think my political science major in particular, I think what I realized through my environmental science degree was how much we were really quite clear about what the problem was. And that this wasn't, there's always more you can know and more you can understand and models you can run and yada, yada. But it was, for me, it felt quite clear that we knew what was happening. And the challenge was the lack of political will. And that's actually why I joined the political science department as well, was because I wanted to figure out how do we get this missing link of the political will. And I still believe to this date, I really think the technology is there and getting there, and the science is there, and the political will continues to just be that missing piece. And that's where I think social movements really build the appetite for political will. Yeah, and also some of those stuff that I said at the beginning about like democracy and our role, and the way that movements are actually how we take up space as in a democracy and how we participate in a democracy fully. And I feel like I really understood that much more viscerally and clearly through my political science work as well. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here today. I was really looking forward to this event because, as you talked about, it's so important to have hope in these times and to organize around a vision that you believe in and a vision that is good. I would just like to know a little bit more about how you're doing that, because I still feel like I need some help.
About hope or the vision, or you want to say anything more about that? About hope, yeah. That is very real. I'm actually going to read something. This is a quote by a former political dissident, was also an elected official in Eastern Europe, whose name is Václav Havel. And I actually really appreciate this quote and it's about hope. And he says, hope is an orientation of the spirit. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. Hope in this deep and powerful sense is not the same as joy that things are going well or a willingness to invest in something that is obviously headed for early success, but the ability to work for something because it is good, not because it stands a chance to succeed. It is hope, above all, which gives the strength to live and continually try new things. And I love that, and I return to that quote a lot because I think this concept of hope being this orientation of a spirit, it's the stance with which we meet the world. It is like an expression of ourself in relationship to the world. And I really believe that hope is chosen. It is chosen and it is forged in action and in community. And I think in this moment, we actually can't really afford blind optimism or abject pessimism. We cannot afford either of those things. And what the last 10 years has taught me is that the world is messy, it is rough and tumble, it is full of contradictions and gray spaces and uncertainty. And courage is actually being able to sit in that uncertainty and find what the next right thing that you can do with a group of people is, and know that there just may not be easy answers, but that it matters. It really, really matters what we do. Yeah. Thanks.
Hello.
Hey.
I feel like I keep following you around.
I know.
So my question
It's
actually
awesome.
connects slightly to something at the place I saw you earlier today, but also to your talk. So I sort of, am realizing, right, that this is the movements that we're participating in right now, right, are going to take decades, or will likely be going on for decades unless something really crazy happens. And, as somebody who has definitely cared about this issue for a long time, but has only recently started really getting involved in activism, how do you do that for decades? How do you do that for 10, I suppose in your case, 12 years or longer? Because I already feel like, only having been sort of active in Sunrise here at UMass for several months is really tiring. And, I think also, I suppose another aspect is how do you, keep that momentum going and change the movement, encourage it to develop, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Joshua. Okay, well, don't think about the decades yet. Just focus semester on semester. That's great. That's great. You don't have to plan out for the decades yet. I think part of, the kind of like sustainability of the earth, it also applies to the sustainability of the self. And I think there's two things I want to say about that. One, the cultivation of habits that serve as the foundations from which you can build are really, really, really important. And I mean like really granular. Are you drinking water? Are you sleeping? Are you moving your body? Are you quieting your mind? Are you spending time in nature? Are you laughing with your friends? And that level of granularity of foundations, I have found the world just seems 100 times more awful when that's not going so well, and your resilience, the depletion of your resilience actually is quite existential to your capacity to be in this fight. So that's one thing I'll say, and the more that you can, where'd you go? Ah, there you are. I'm the more that you can really solidify, just picking one at a time and starting to build that, I feel like now, 10 years later, I have a lot more habits, and they started slowly, but I feel like I can go back to that, those foundations much, much more quickly than I could at the beginning. I think the other thing I'd say is, and there's this amazing Zen teacher, community organizer, former elected official, Norma Wong, who's based in Hawaii and does a lot of really amazing work out there. And she always kind of says, you know, if the entire Earth is operating in seasons and these systems that are so much larger than us are operating in seasons, then so should we. And that you can't really sustain a level of activity for too much longer than, let's say, like a season, 3 or 4 months. And what I find is that people want and pretend like they are beyond nature and move at a pace that is like being in your summer or whatever your busy season. I guess if you're on campus, being in your fall, like for a significant amount of time without actually like honoring the heights of that and honoring the kind of troughs of that. And seeing your life as like, there are moments to be active and out, and there are moments to be in rest and in reflection, and doing that intentionally and allowing yourself to do that intentionally and realizing that it is actually about being a part of a larger rhythm that is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a quote that I like that a lot of organizers have said, we don't need sprinters, we need long-distance runners. We need people to be in the movement for life and to do what they need to do to take care of themselves so that they can be in the movement for life.
Hi, I just had a general question. What was your main decision, your main influence to join or to create Sunrise? Sorry, how was that how did that just come about? What was the main factor of how you decided that you wanted to make Sunrise?
I had really good comrades to do it with. There's just not a chance. There's this weird thing with the executive director, founder, blah, 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 whatever. Those are just titles. Really, the way that Sunrise came about was in community and was a number of us who were just looking at the world around us, all of you are, and being what is this life that people have left us? Why have the adults done this to us? And realizing if they were asleep at the wheel, we had to pick up the slack. And, but none of it, I think, could have happened. It wasn't me on my own. It was me with a group of 12 of us that were looking at these problems and processing our grief and charting out a vision and then turning that into campaigns. And I don't know if there was any one moment, but I do believe it was in community. And oh yeah, this is what it was. It was after some really bad failures. Yeah, it was after some really, really bad failures. And so sometimes when you experience failure, people are okay, I'm out. That was too hard. It didn't work. I'm out of here. But I think if you can let the failure actually season you and grow in you as an understanding that didn't work and we need to try something better, then that's where magic can happen. Really, really. Because I think a lot of us grew in community around those failures, and Sunrise actually emerged out of that. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, it looks like we're just about out of time. Maybe we could do a last round, 1, 2, 3 in succession, and then Varshini could respond, if that's.
Hi, I just wanted to know, as a woman of color, how do you find the courage to assert yourself in activist spaces, especially ones that aren't necessarily built for, or people like you, I guess?
I don't know if it's, whatever. Yeah, I don't know how connected it is, but I did want to hear what's next for you, Varshini. And yeah, when you kind of know it's time to change course.
I had a question involving, you mentioned an emergence of some sort of a corporatist structure in this country. I see back to the 80s with Reagan legalizing stock buybacks, and even further back than that with political machines. Corruption is pretty deeply rooted in this country, and I'm wondering why just now we're seeing that there's an emergence.
Great. Okay, my pen died, so I might need help remembering the questions. Thank you. Oh man, such a good question. Okay, as a woman of color, well, there's no one else there, so we got to do it. We got to do it. You know, I did spend a lot of time being like, especially because I was like, you know, on some of the politics stuff and the policy stuff, and I was always the youngest person generally, and then oftentimes one of the few women, and then usually the only woman of color. And it was scary, and it was nerve-wracking. And I guess I just had to tell myself over and over again that I deserve to be in those rooms, that my opinion matters, that the opinion of young people matters, that the opinion of women of color matters, and that just as much as everyone else, we deserve to take up space and we deserve to belong. And that actually this country needs our perspective, like badly, to set sound policy, to set sound strategy, to direct resources to the communities that need them most. So yeah, happy to talk about it more, but I think just that reminder over and over again. The second one, oh yeah, okay, what am I doing? So I'm currently working with this organization called the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict. And we are, it's an outfit that helps train and coach and research for lots of different civil resistance movements around the globe. And we're currently on a project to figure out within ICNC what work we could do to bolster and develop new climate movements in the United States. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a bit of a drop-off in the last few years in the aftermath of the pandemic. Hopefully all of you will help restart that as well. But thinking about kind of like how we can incubate and develop some new climate movements for the next few years and what that might look like. It's in pretty nascent and research stages, but yeah, that's what I'm currently working on. And then, I'm so sorry, I think I missed the last one.
Corruption and oligarchy.
Just like vibes about it. No, I'm just kidding.
What is distinct about the current moment?
Oh, I see. Okay. I think this moment is pretty different in a lot of ways. I think in large part, the key difference, I think, is the role of Elon Musk and the kind of just like unfettered, although a lot of this is being challenged by lawyers and many organizations, just the like unfettered ability he has had to just like defy social norms, ignore the Constitution. And I think there has been if you look at Project 2025, it's a pretty explicit plan to attempt to purge many key agencies, put loyalists and weaponize them against opposition, basically like enact this widespread kind of weaponization of the state, both against its own people, against the federal workforce, against the opposition. I don't think that we're gonna like fall into full, complete dictatorship, but I think what experts are saying are that we are more likely to move into sort of like this competitive authoritarianism type of place where a country still holds elections or things like that, but that there are certain elements of democracy that are lost. And so I do think, there's this organization called the Polity Project, which kind of tracks and records like political behavior of a lot of different states around the world. And after the 2024 Supreme Court ruling, they kind of downgraded the United States to a non-democracy status. And kind of this like assertion that the president is king above the law, like that is completely, it's not just deregulation at an extreme level. This is a different beast that we are playing with. And I think it merits a really, really significant response to the extent that everyone, whatever we can do to push back, I think we really have to do it because we're in a dangerous moment. That's so depressing to leave on. Should I just read the hope quote again? But we can and we are fighting back.
All right, let's give it up for Varshini Prakash.